Good evening, everybody. We're thankful that you have decided to join us this evening for our midweek Bible study. Before we get into that study, I do want to give a handful of announcements. The first announcement is please remember to pray for your church family. We have a handful of folks in our church that are going through some issues physically and otherwise. We need to be praying for them, praying for one another during this difficult time of separation. But we'll be praying for you, and as we hope and pray that you'll be praying for us as well. Also, remember our missionaries. Some of the stories and some of the reports that have been given of what some of our missionaries are going through there on the mission field, or even some that aren't able to be on the mission field where their heart is. We need to be praying for those mission works, and that God will continue to work and provide wisdom and understanding for our missionaries during this time. Also, remember to pray for our services this weekend. Sunday, our drive-in church service at 11 o'clock. We are so very thankful that God's given us the opportunity of having these drive-in services. And we're thankful for everyone that's been coming and attending. In no way has it been without its difficulty, and in no way has it been perfect. But we're thankful that God has given us the opportunity on His day to worship Him, spirit and in truth, come together, to lift up our voices in one accord and sing praises to His name. We're thankful for that. We're thankful for the Holy Spirit moving in those services, and we're going to continue to have them until we're able to meet again in the sanctuary. So pray for them. We meet again every Sunday at 11 o'clock in the morning, and we do pray that we see every one of you there this Sunday at 11. And the last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the lesson this evening is the lesson itself. We've been doing a study in the book of Proverbs, going through it verse by verse for a number of months now, and tonight we're heading into chapter number 5. I do enjoy preaching through books of the Bible verse by verse for many different reasons. One of them is because it gives me the opportunity to address things that may otherwise go overlooked or be overlooked due to discomfort in the topic at hand. Over the next few chapters, there will be a bit of content discussed that will require some of you parents to exercise some discernment. I will in no way be graphic in delivering these studies, but some of the topics may be better addressed in a different setting for your children than watching me over a social media page or social media video. So with that being said, I'd like for those of you that are parents that have children in the room, I would like for you to take this time to read over chapter number 5 and then proceed as you feel the Lord is leading you to. Good evening. We'd like you to take your Bibles, turn to the book of Proverbs, chapter number 5. In our study in the book of Proverbs, we've seen so far Solomon writing to his son. He's giving him an understanding of what wisdom is, and we've entitled this entire series, Wisdom for Living. We've seen in chapter 1 the proclamation of wisdom, what it is, wisdom's pathway. Chapter 2, chapter 3 was wisdom's promises, wisdom's pattern. And then here in chapter number 5, we're looking at wisdom's parameters. Now, we've addressed what wisdom is. Wisdom is the application of knowledge. What is knowable of God, what is knowable in His Word, of His character, of all those things, what is knowable and understandable of God, applying that to your life makes you wise. That is wisdom for living. And so, with that being said, as we determine and as we find out more and more about God and what it is that He has for us and how He wants us to live, and as we understand more about His character and His requirements of humanity as a whole, we need to understand that based on His holiness, based on His His righteousness, His holiness, His justness, based on everything of who He is, there are some parameters in our life that need to be in place if we're going to live a wise life. If we're going to apply that knowledge, it'll set up parameters in our life. And Solomon is addressing some of those parameters this evening. And so Proverbs chapter number 5, we're going to start reading in verse 1 and go through 14. He says, "My son, attend unto my wisdom, and bow thine ear unto my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and that thy lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of the strange woman drip as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from my words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house, lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labor be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teacher, nor inclined my ear to them that instruct me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly." As we're going through this section of Proverbs, it's important for us to understand that there are some, as far as the parameters of what wisdom, the parameters placed in our life on what we are to do, how we are to carry ourselves, things we are to do and not to do. It's important for us to understand the parameters here. We are given an understanding. Solomon is telling his son that there are some enemies to wisdom. There's enemies to the life of wisdom. And so the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God being applied to your life and you living up to His standard of living, there are some enemies that you're going to encounter as a result of that. And so an enemy of wisdom is divulged for us here in this chapter, and we're going to continue reading about it in the next couple of chapters. But we're starting out an enemy of wisdom, verses 1 through 14. In this section of Scripture, as I've said, Solomon is teaching his son again about wisdom, but he's teaching his son here about the dangers of sexual sin. The strange woman spoken of in verse 3 is someone other than familiar through the marital relationship. This is someone outside of marriage. It can represent anyone or anything outside of this sacred union that he's talking about. In the context of these verses today, Solomon is most likely writing about a harlot or a prostitute. God created sex and has every right to place any and every limitation that He likes on it. It is designed by God for mankind to both be able to procreate and to enhance their marital relationship. Any sexual or physical relationship outside of the covenant of marriage fits under the category of sexual sin. I think that it is interesting to note that the temptation addressed in this chapter can honestly be applied to any temptation of any sort. It doesn't just have to be limited to sexual sin. It could be any temptation at all. So the warning being emphasized by Solomon can and should be regarded continually, which is what he's going to address in our first two verses. Let's look at what it is he has to say. "My son, attend unto my wisdom, and bow thine ear unto my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and that thy lips may keep knowledge." The first thing he draws his son's attention to, and the first thing he gives him instruction in chapter 5 is to rehearse the attack. If wisdom or the life of wisdom has an enemy, and it takes the form of sexual sin or sexual promiscuity, or however it is you want to look at it, if that is an enemy to wisdom, it's important for us to rehearse that, to go over it, to remember what's recorded in God's Word, what we've been taught, what we've learned about this topic. If sexual sin or temptation in general is an enemy of wisdom, what does it look like and how can we protect ourselves against this enemy? 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, is a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. This sexual sin, it is a product of the enemy. It is a product of the devil who is trying to destroy us in our relationship with God. It is a tool or a tactic that he's been using since the beginning of time, since man and woman were first created. It's a tactic that he's used to try to disrupt or to ruin an individual's relationship with God. And so he's on the prowl, he's on the attack, he's looking whom he may devour. James chapter 1 verse 14, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. The devil uses what he can to draw us away of the lust that we have inside of us, the desires that we have. And so it's important for us to remember that inside of us, we have a desire to do wrong. We're drawn away of our own. We're tempted of our own lust and enticed, and he uses that to devour us. He breaks, Solomon says 4 things in these first 2 verses. My son, attend to my wisdom, that's 1. Bow thine ear to understanding. He says, listen to what it is I'm saying and learn what it is that I mean or how it applies to your life. Verse 2, that thou mayest regard discretion and that thy lips may keep knowledge. He says, let them shape your decision making. Let them shape the way that you think. Don't just listen and learn what it means and how it applies, but allow that to shape your mind to having thinking the right way concerning these things. And the second thing, let it shape the decisions that you make, the choices that you make, but also look to warn others. He says that your lips may keep knowledge, that you can pass on this understanding and these truths. Then we go to verses 3 and 4. For the lips of the strange woman drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. He gives us an understanding to resist her advances. It talks about her speech, the way that the things that she says, or the way that she tries to seduce, the words that come from this strange woman, this woman outside of the boundaries of marriage. Her speech, she offers you every imaginable pleasure. That's the attack. That's the way. That's the operating process of Satan since the very beginning, offering you every pleasure that you could possibly imagine. And as it comes in the form of sexual sin, we can understand what it's saying, offering you every imaginable pleasure. That's her speech, whispering to you and building you up, puffing you up with the words that come out of her mouth. It's like a honeycomb. Her mouth, her lips are like honeycomb, or smoother than oil. All the promises of pleasure that she offers is part of her speech. But we need to understand her snare is revealed for us in verse 4. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. She offers you every imaginable pleasure. But all that she delivers is poison. Whether it be sexual sin or any other temptation that may come our way, as we are enticed, as the words or as the presentation for us, as honey and as smooth as oil, presenting to us every pleasure that we could possibly imagine. The thought of that fulfillment in our life. Understand that if it's outside of the boundaries that the knowledge of God and wisdom for living offers, if it's outside the boundaries that God places in our life, it is poison. Verses 5 and 6. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell, lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life. Her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Resist her advances and reject her attractions. Now, as we see here, her seduction, the way that she goes about things, as it talks about her path and the end of her path, as it talks about the way that she attracts and the things that she does, it's painting for us a picture. And to make it as easy for me to understand as possible without being graphic in any way, as I look at this seduction, I envision in my mind, oddly enough, a deer hunter. Someone who goes out of his way to set up a place for him to hunt, and before the season even opens, he puts out the bait to get the deer coming in, so that when it comes time for hunting season to start, that they're in a pattern and they are continually coming and continually eating, and that they don't think that there's any danger around them. That's the picture that I see as Solomon is talking about the pathway, or the way that the strange woman seduces. The deer comes in, as it has time and time again, and it eats, not realizing it. It's so focused on feeling its own desire that it doesn't recognize the strange smell in the area, or the strange quietness, what's going on. It sneaks in and it just starts eating, and it's not concerned with what's going on around it. And as a result of it eating, it's so distracted by its own desires, it's being deceived, and it doesn't even know it. And the deer puts itself in a dangerous situation. That's what we can see happening here in verses 5 and 6. Her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst know them. Her steps, according to these verses, lead to regret. Indulging in and falling victim to the attraction of sexual sin and the offer, the allure of pleasure. It leads us to regret. It leads us, not just that, but it leads us to returning. It sets inside of us. It feeds inside of us that desire that comes from within of pleasure. It leads us to regret. It leads us to return. And according to these verses, it leads us to ultimate ruin. Her path, or her feet go down to death. We don't know it because we're so attracted by what's before our eyes. We're so consumed with what's going on, with what it is that she has to offer. We're so distracted. We're so deceived that we don't recognize the danger, the path that we're walking on, that leads to death, according to verse 5, and steps that take hold of hell. It leads us away from God, and it will lead us to ruin if we don't exercise discretion, discernment, and wisdom concerning sexual sin. The next thing we look at, verses 7 and 8. Hear me now, therefore, O children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house. Solomon re-emphasizes the importance of avoiding sexual sin and temptation as a whole in verse number 5. He says, Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Echoing my son, verse 1, attend unto my wisdom, and thine ear unto understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and the lips may keep knowledge. Hear, verse 7. Hear me now, therefore, children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. He re-emphasizes the importance of avoiding sexual sin and all temptation in verse 5. And in verse 6, he gives a simple yet profound way to escape the dangers that sexual sin and temptation present. Simple yet profound. Here's what he says. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house. Here's the twofold way to avoid all that danger, to avoid all that trouble. Don't get on the road that leads to where she is. Now, like I said, it applies to every form of temptation, not just sexual sin. If we want to avoid the danger, if we want to escape the ruin and the turmoil of giving into temptation, if we want to avoid that, then we need to stay off the road that leads there. That's easy enough for us to understand. If this is a road that takes me to Raleigh and I don't want to go to Raleigh, I need to stay off that road. If this is a road that takes me to South Carolina or to Myrtle Beach and I know that that's the road that takes me there, if I don't want to go there, I need to stay off that road. Don't get on the road that leads to her. Don't go to her house. That's literally what he says. Look, use your brain. Remove thy way from far from her. Don't get on the road that leads to her, and come not nigh the door of her house. To avoid the danger of sexual sin and temptation, there may be some things you will have to sacrifice in your life in order to be victorious in this way. Some friends and relationships, some people you may have to separate yourself from if you are going to heed this verse of removing yourself far from her and come not nigh unto her. There may be some places you're going to have to avoid going. There may be some hobbies you're going to have to give up. Some forms of entertainment that you're going to have to give up, whether it be television or movies or computers or even smartphones. If you have a problem with what you click on, what you look at on your phone or on your computer, get rid of it. It's simply not worth it. If you have a problem with giving in to temptation every time you go to a certain place, Solomon tells his son, don't go to that certain place. If I have a problem going into gas stations and buying things that I shouldn't buy, avoid going into gas stations. You say, how do you do that? I need gas. Well, you can buy it at the pump. Sometimes it takes a little bit of discomfort in order for us to exercise discretion and wisdom. If I have a problem going to this store because of what they have, or if I have a problem going to this town because the people that are there, if I have a problem going to this place because running into old friends, if any of that is the case, if I have a problem in that area, exercising wisdom means sometimes saying, I'm going to sacrifice that. It's just not worth it to me. And he goes on to talk about that in our last verses. Here, me now, therefore, O ye children, depart not the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her. Come not nigh to the door of her house. Don't go near her house. Don't get on the road that leads to her, and any of those things. And then he gives the reason why he's so emphatic in verse 7. Why is Solomon so adamant about his sons avoiding sexual sin and temptation? Because of the aftermath. Because of the result or the fallout. Kent Hughes put it this way concerning what it is he's going to talk about here concerning sex and sexual sin. As we've talked about, it was created of God, and it was something God has created for us to both be able to have children and procreate, but also for the purpose of us enhancing our marriages. And it's a wonderful thing when exercised with wisdom. But when an individual steps outside of the boundaries that the wisdom or the knowledge of God provides in their life, when they step outside of that, they put themselves in danger. Again, Kent Hughes says this, sex is like fire. Inside the fireplace, it'll keep us warm and cozy. But outside the fireplace, it'll burn our houses to the ground. What is it that he's saying in verses 9 through 14? Let's break them down individually and see what it is that he has to say for us. Lest thou give thine honor unto others, and your years unto the cruel. If we play with fire, as Kent Hughes said, we're going to get burned. If we mess around with sin, if we mess around with temptation, if we don't treat it the way verse 8 tells us to, remove ourselves far from it and don't go to the place that it is, if we don't do that, we can rest assured it'll end up burning us. We've all seen, we all know somebody or have heard stories of folks whose lives have been burnt as a result of sexual sin, marriages and homes that have been torn apart. So what is it that he says in verse 9? Lest I give thine honor to another and the years to the cruel, the messing with sin and playing with sin and giving in to temptation and dabbling in things that we have no business dabbling in, giving ourselves over to sexual temptation, to sexual immorality or sexual sin. It will leave us bankrupt in 5 different ways. He says in verse 9, it'll leave us personally bankrupt. Accepting dishonor, giving our honor to somebody else, accepting dishonor as okay and as acceptable in our life. Making yourself a slave is what it's talking about, and thy years under the cruel. Making ourselves a slave to sexual sin. We know folks that have been destroyed by that and whose lives are continually being destroyed, that they've made themselves a slave to this sin. Accepting their dishonor as just par for the course. Well, that's just who I am, and that's just a struggle I'm going to continue to have. It leaves an individually, personally bankrupt, but not just that, financially bankrupt. I'm not going to try to go into anything again too graphic, but we can see, he says, lest a stranger be filled with thy wealth, and the labor be in the house of a stranger. This again, as we addressed earlier, is probably talking about a harlot or a prostitute, so we can understand the financial ramification of an individual giving themselves over to sexual sin. It also, not just personally bankrupt, financially bankrupt, it'll leave them physically bankrupt. And verse 11, and thou mourn at the last, when you get to the end of your life, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. Sexual sin brings with it and comes along with disease and other things of that nature. Sexual diseases tear lives apart. Folks die from sexual diseases, and it's not something to joke around about. It's a very serious thing. All sin comes with consequence. Physically bankrupt. How about morally bankrupt? Verses 12 and 13, and say, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instruct me. Look, I have turned my back on everything that I know to be right because of sin, because of my addiction, because I have made myself a slave to this. It's left me not just personally, financially, physically bankrupt, but it's left me morally bankrupt. What I knew to be right, I've abandoned completely. Socially bankrupt. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. My sin had so taken hold of me that it had led me so far away from what I knew to be right and what I knew to be wrong, that it led me to accepting things that are absolutely forbidden, things that I absolutely would have no part in. We've heard the phrase before, sin will take you further than you want to go and keep you longer than you want to stay. This verse goes along with that. Look, I was almost guilty of everything. Not just being guilty, but also before everybody. My sin was ever before me, and it was before everybody. There was nothing hidden. Behold, your sin will find you out. Socially bankrupt, morally bankrupt, physically bankrupt, financially bankrupt, personally bankrupt. He says if you play with fire, it will burn you. So by all means, in every way possible, please, listen. Listen to the things that I'm saying in verse 7. Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. We have an enemy to wisdom, an enemy to the life of God. We need to rehearse her attack and recognize that she's on the prowl. It's not just the sexual sin that we know people get involved in. It's temptation of all sorts. Recognize that the devil is trying to destroy us. Recognize the assault that he wages against us. Resist her advances. Her smooth, sweet words offering us pleasure. Recognize all it brings is poison. Reject her attraction, the way that she seduces you, distracting you and deceiving you, leading you into this place of danger, a place of regret, and a place of ruin. Reject her attraction. Remove yourself from her address. Don't go near it. Don't get on the road. Don't end up on her front doorstep. Don't play with it. Don't mess with it. Don't compromise in any way. The very best thing that we can do when confronted with sexual sin or any temptation at all is to turn and run. It's not the coward's way out. The reality is, the devil is stronger than I am. The devil is more mighty than I am. I don't have the capability of overcoming this temptation on my own. So if I'm going to be victorious, it's going to be God's way. And He gives us this understanding. Turn and run. Recognize the aftermath. We have no idea the long-lasting effect sexual sin or any temptation will have on us, on our children, on our churches, on our friends, our family. If sexual sin has her way in our life, it'll leave us personally bankrupt, financially, physically, morally, and socially bankrupt. I would say that the pros definitely don't outweigh the cons. The pro, an offer of emptiness. The result, absolute devastation and ruin. We've got to make the choice. We've got to recognize the enemy of wisdom. The knowledge of God, the understanding of God has placed boundaries in our life. The parameters are placed there for our good, for our protection. But it's up to us to stay within those boundaries.